World War II was one of the worst wars of all time. It began when Hitler invaded Poland in 1939.
During the first 2 years of the war, the U.S., also known as the best country of all time, stayed neutral. Germany, on the other hand, overran France and most of Europe.
Hitler, being the worst villain of all time, turned on his allies and invaded the Soviet Union. Even though the U.S. stayed neutral, they supplied Britain with war supplies. The act that made this possible was called the Lend-Lease Act of 1941.
War was not only in Europe, but also in Asia. In the 1930s, Japan invaded and destroyed cities in Manchuria and China. The United States imposed an embargo on Japan's imports of oil and steel. Both countries agreed to avoid war, even though they had high tensions.
Japan carried out a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. President Roosevelt called this date a date that will live in infamy. That quote is one of the best quotes of all time. The air attack destroyed much of the Pacific Fleet and killed several thousands. After Pearl Harbor, Hitler sided with Japan and declared war on the U.S.
After Pearl Harbor, Americans were afraid of Japanese people giving secrets to the Japanese. This was extreme prejudice against Japanese Americans. Japanese Americans were put in internment camps.
America and its allies needed to defeat Hitler first. European nations all wanted to use the method of containing Hitler. The U.S. strategy for the Pacific was called island hopping. Island hopping is when you go from island to another, claiming every island until they got to Japan. Island hopping carried the war closer and closer to Japan. They destroyed Japanese business and cut off Japanese supplies.
When Germany attacked the Soviet Union, they planned to defeat them quickly. The Germans also wanted to pull Britain out of the war by bombing and submarine attacks.
After Pearl Harbor, Japan invaded the Philippines and Indonesia and planned to invade Australia and Hawaii. The German forces were threatened to siege Egypt in the Battle of Alamein, and they were defeated by the British. This defeat prevented Hitler from getting further oil supplies from the Middle East.
The Russian city of Stalingrad was attacked by the Germans and hundreds of thousands of soldiers were killed or captured in a months-long siege. This again prevented the Germans from reaching oil sources. The Normandy landings, or D-Day, happened on June 6, 1944. The soldiers consisted of American and Allied under the General Eisenhower. They landed in the beaches of France to push back the Germans. Although there were many casualties on both sides, the landings were successful and pushed back Hitler and the Germans.
In the Battle of Midway, the Americans' naval forces defeated a much larger Japanese force. This was called the Miracle at Midway. The battles of Iwo Jima and Okinawa cost thousands of lives on both sides. Japanese soldiers had the strategy to fight to the death and to commit suicide rather than surrendering.
President Harry Truman ordered the use of the atomic bomb on cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force the Japanese to surrender. Many thousands of people died in both cities, but in the end, Japan surrendered and the Americans didn't need to invade any longer.
In the 1940s, there was a lot of racism by supersingly African Americans served in the military. They were not put in combat roles, rather they were put in support roles.
There were different minority military units. One was Tuskegee Airmen. They were African American and they served in Europe with distinction. Another group was the Nazi regiments. They were Asian American and they earned a high number of decorations.
The minorities had few contributions to the war. They used communication codes like the Navajo used. It was impossible for the Japanese to break this code. Mexicans fought, but they did in non-segregated units. Minorities units suffered a lot. Much casualty happened, but in return they earned medals and bravery and numerous unit citations.
The Geneva Convention was to ensure the humane treatment of prisoners of war. Before the Geneva Convention, American POWs suffered by beatings and torture. In the Pacific Theater, the Japanese often committed suicide rather than being captured.
The Holocaust was one of the largest tragedies of all time. It was something known as a genocide, which is systematic and purposeful destruction of a racial, political, religious, or cultural group. Hitler had a final solution. The final solution was to exterminate all the Jews.
Not only were the Jews being exterminated, Poles, Slavs, Gypsies, homosexuals, mentally ill, political dissidents, and more were also affected. The Nazis made the Jewish wear the Stars of David. This made it easy to set them apart from the rest of the people. Then they took the Jewish people to concentration camps where they were put to death using many different methods.
One of the methods was a mustard gas shower. They would trick the Jews into thinking they were taking a shower, but actually water didn't come out. Mustard gas was used instead of this, killed the Jews and non-desirables. Another method was that they would put them in ovens and burn them to death. They also starved them to death. Around 11 million people were killed during the Holocaust.
Hitler eventually committed suicide. After that, the Axis powers surrendered, which meant the Allied powers won the war. Soon after, Nuremberg trials were held. The Nuremberg trials were trials against Nazi war leaders and others convicted of war crimes. Regardless of orders received, the Nuremberg trials emphasized responsibility. So you were still convicted even if you were told to do a crime and not actually gave the order. The trials made the Jews want their own homeland. The homeland would soon be Israel.
During the war on the home front, the people of the United States mobilizing its economic, human, and military resources. Some economic resources that they used was a rationing supplies to support the war effort. War bonds and income tax were also used for financing the war. Businesses also changed what they did in factories such as car manufacturing to tank manufacturing. Most of the men were off at war, so the women were entering the workforce. Many Americans also volunteered to support the war effort. The Selective Service was used to provide personnel for the military. Men really wanted to support the country at this time, unlike when the Vietnam was.
Women on the home front typically participated in non-combat military roles. A political figure for women was Rosie the Riveter. African Americans also worked in war plant. They also campaigned for equality and victory for their country.
The U.S. government maintained a strict censorship of the war. The Americans were very focused on the war effort. The movie business produced movies, plays, and they were very patriotic. The movies were also very stereotypical.